Hello and welcome to Tea Time. I'm joined today by the wonderful Dr. Desiree Galante, and Dr. Des is located in Virginia, in Alexandria, Virginia. She's a naturopathic doctor, and she's the co-founder of Terrain Clinic, again in Alexandria, Virginia, and she specializes in women's health and wellness. So we're going to talk about fertility today and get some wonderful wisdom and tips from Dr. Des. Before we delve into that, we're going to talk about milk thistle tea. And milk thistle is a wonderful plant. It's really well known for being supportive for the liver. So we call it hepatosupportive. That's what it's most well known for. The Latin name for milk thistle is silybum, which is kind of a fun name to say. Silybum. It's spelled S-I-L-Y-B-U-M. So it's missing an L, but silybum. And so again, milk thistle protects the liver. And it also helps to restore liver function and to kind of prevent liver impairment from happening, or if it is already happening, to help things move through the liver more easily. So the liver, as we know, is very important for your body's detoxification pathways. There's a lot of different things that have to happen in the liver for your body to get rid of things that are toxic or waste metabolites, including things like hormones and natural products of daily life, not necessarily anything that you're doing wrong, but your liver has to do a lot to process all of the stuff that comes into your body. So when that function is a little bit impaired, milk thistle can come in and help out. So milk thistle, again, the Latin name is silybum, and there is a constituent in milk thistle called silymarin. And silymarin, sometimes these compounds in plants have a similar name to the Latin name for the plant, which is just kind of fun to say for some of them. So silymarin. Silymarin can help if there's fibrosis going on in the liver or potentially somewhere else in the body. Silymarin can kind of help to clean that up. It also can help to clean up free radicals and oxidative damage. It has some antioxidant activity in that respect. When we are, and I want to mention that milk thistle can also, in addition to being liver supportive, it can also be supportive for your digestive tract, and again, for potential other fibroses throughout the body. So when you are using milk thistle, you do want to be a little bit cautious with a couple things. One is that if you are taking medications or even some supplements and they're processed through your liver, as you know, most everything is, you may need an adjustment in the dosage of what you're taking if you're using milk thistle regularly. And tea is a pretty gentle form of milk thistle, but especially if you happen to be taking a more concentrated supplement and that's helping your liver to function better and more efficiently, you might need an adjustment in your medication. The other thing is, because milk thistle really supports those liver pathways, and we actually use it a lot in different detoxifications and even cleanses, you do want to be careful if you're pregnant or trying to become pregnant and are using milk thistle, because when you're releasing kind of the toxic stuff that can build up in the liver when you're opening those pathways with milk thistle's help and releasing that stuff, you want to get it out of your body and you don't want it to go into fetal circulation potentially. So really important to not do any kind of detox when you're pregnant. And Dr. Des can tell us a lot more about that, I'm sure, because that's her specialty. But just in general, you do want to be cautious with that, and always check with your own doctor, a naturopathic doctor or an herbalist, someone familiar with plant medicine, to find out what's right for you. So I think that's everything that I wanted to say about milk thistle. Dr. Des, is there anything that you'd like to add about milk thistle tea right now?
I think so. You did a really awesome job covering everything. I think, definitely, especially when we're looking at like hormonal imbalance, supporting liver detoxification is so important, right? Especially as women, with like everything that we're exposed to in our makeup and our lotion and, pesticides in foods and things like that. So liver support and detoxification support is definitely something really important that I focus on with a lot of the women that I work with.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll just mention with the tea, again, tea is a really gentle form of milk thistle, right? So a supplemental form is going to be more concentrated and stronger, certainly, and often it will be standardized to a certain silymarin content. Um, but the tea itself, it has kind of like an earthier taste and a little bit of like a sweet aftertaste, I think. It's not super bitter, but it's like a different tasting tea. Is there any way you would describe it, Dr. Daz?
I think earthy is kind of spot on. It almost has kind of like a grassy taste to it a little bit. But yeah, it's not one that I drink super commonly, but I definitely have had it a little bit in the past.
Yeah, cool. All right. All right. So cheers to milk thistle here.
Cheers.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit now, Dr. Des, let's talk a little bit about women's health and like fertility planning and that sort of thing, since that's really a big specialty of yours. When someone comes to you, whether it's just the woman or the couple who comes to you and they're wanting to conceive, what are some of the more common issues or concerns that you might see with people?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's kind of like two different groups of women that I see. So one group, which is definitely the smaller group, are women who are like ready to get pregnant and they're just kind of looking to like, what can I do to make myself healthier before I try to conceive? And then the much larger group of women are women who have been trying to conceive for, years usually. And a lot of them have gone through multiple rounds of IVF and IUI, and they've all failed, and they've had, a lot of the times a few miscarriages. So they're definitely in more of like a fragile state, right? Than the women who are kind of just like excited to get going. So the ones who are just like looking to prep for fertility are really easy. I love working with them, right? Because they're just kind of like optimizing their health. But I also love working with the other group of women because I know there's so much that we can do to support them and things and areas that they haven't explored yet. So with kind of the women who are struggling, I'll start with them because I think it's more applicable to your question. Usually what we're looking at are different forms of like hormonal imbalances. So that's probably one of the most common things. So a lot of the times they'll have a diagnosis that they either were recently diagnosed with or sometimes even diagnosed with, when they were a teenager and kind of never thought about it anymore. So PCOS is definitely a big one. I see a ton of women with PCOS, which is polycystic ovarian syndrome for anyone who's not familiar. And so basically, these women are put on birth control when they're diagnosed and they're kind of not really educated or told anything else about it. But then when they get off birth control and it's time to try to have a baby, then they're kind of seeing all these hormonal imbalances resurfacing. So PCOS is a big one. Endometriosis is definitely another one as well. So women with endometriosis have a much higher likelihood of having miscarriages and a lot of difficulty conceiving. So I work with a lot of women who have endometriosis, and we're trying to readdress the root cause, which is what we do with naturopathic medicine. Because a lot of the times, in the conventional world, birth control is a very common tool that doctors use for these. And obviously, if you're trying to get pregnant, you can't use birth control. So sometimes they just don't have the answers or other tools to offer. So yeah, endometriosis, PCOS, and then just kind of like, PMS or hormonal symptoms in general. So if women are having a lot of mood changes, severe cramping, if their bleeding is all over the place in terms of their period, those are all kind of red flags that their cycle is not healthy and normal, right? So a lot of the times we're working on balancing those symptoms so that we can get their hormones and their cycles in a healthier place. And then it's easier for them to try to conceive. And then also there's a very large group of women who like came off birth control and essentially their periods and cycles have been irregular since then. So it's also kind of, like supporting the body coming off birth control while simultaneously supporting their hormones.
Yeah, so interesting. What are some things that can potentially be helpful for women who are struggling to conceive? And of course, we're kind of, in a sense, just because we're condensing things here, we're leaving out the male factor a little bit and focusing on the females. But I do want to recognize that, male health is important as well for fertility, for conception. But just in terms of our conversation here, because it's kind of condensed for the women, what are some things that can be helpful? And of course, it's always individualized. So any nuggets that you want to share or thoughts would be great.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and just to kind of touch on what you said about the male factor. So typically with fertility cases, you're looking at kind of the women weighing about 60% of the case and the men about 40%. So it's always, really good for an idea for the men to get a workup and just make sure everything is healthy in terms of like sperm quality and motility and all those pieces. But yeah, specifically, I primarily work with the women. So basically what we do, and this is kind of with naturopathic medicine in general, you want to start with the basics, right? So you want to look at what is the quality of the food that they're eating. Are they eating, for kind of like comfort, like fast food, carbs, like those comfort, cheesy, carby type foods? Or is the food nutritionally dense, right? In terms of what they're consuming. And then also the quality of the food is really important, right? So you want to make sure that certain things that need to be organic are organic, because there's certain foods that are very high in pesticides, and pesticides are known hormonal disruptors. So it's really important for us to kind of take out all of those triggers, right? Anything that's going to further push hormones out of whack, we want to make sure that we're taking all of those out of the equation. And then, basics of sleep, right? Are you getting at least 70 hours of sleep per night? Is it uninterrupted? What does your sleep hygiene look like, right? That time before bed, because melatonin production is really important with ovarian quality. And actually, everywhere in the body, melatonin is most highly concentrated in the ovaries. So it plays such a vital role. And if your sleep is off, your melatonin levels are going to be off, right? And melatonin is one of those supplements. Again, you don't want to just take it if you're not working with a doctor, but it's a lot of the supplements that I use a lot of the times with the women that I'm working with, because there's a lot of research on fertility and melatonin. So it's kind of establishing those like foundational principles, right? Making sure everything is in place. Also, when women are, when they've had multiple miscarriages and have gone through, tons of rounds of IVF and IUI, they're in a much more like fragile mental place, right? And usually stress is a huge factor because they kind of feel like their body is failing them, right? Because they can't get pregnant. And then it also is usually a little bit of a financial strain when they're doing it so many times. And it also creates like strain in the relationship often. So I think it's, kind of also reminding the woman to like take time for herself and really create that space, because it becomes a lot of pressure, right? And, stress, it's very common for people to say, oh, you're too stressed, that's why you can't get pregnant, right? And of course, that's definitely a piece of it, but stress definitely elicits these different, physiological processes in the body that definitely impact our sex hormone metabolism, right? And our adrenal health. And your adrenals are so important in kind of regulating these hormonal rhythms as well. So it's usually just really kind of taking a deep dive into the basics to start and making sure everything is healthy there.
Yeah. Awesome. And do you tend to do extensive testing for hormones with people? And if you do see the male also, will you do testing? I guess will you do testing with both partners? And just, I know naturopathically, we order a lot of kind of more comprehensive lab work than just a typical like check off for an annual physical might order. Of course, some other doctors may order comprehensive labs too, but we tend to potentially just look at more factors. So how can you speak to that with regard to fertility support?
Yeah, absolutely. So basically in our clinic, how we have it set up is I work with the female, the women, and then Dr. Rob, the other naturopathic doctor, he sees most of the male cases. So I don't see a ton of male clients, but the testing is pretty similar for both cases, right? So it's applicable to both. The test that I love is the Dutch test, which I'm sure you're familiar with. So the Dutch test is a urine test, and it's known as a functional lab, just meaning, it's not like a lab that your conventional doctor would order. It's kind of like a different type of lab. But a lot of naturopathic doctors and functional doctors utilize it. It's a really easy test that the woman or the man can do at home. And it gives you just like a very comprehensive overview of all of your hormones. So it's primarily looking at sex hormone metabolism and adrenal metabolism. So I'll do that for basically everyone, right? Because I think it's so important, such an important piece for fertility, to know like exactly what's going on hormonally speaking, because some women, and this happens a lot, some women will like assume that something is happening, but it'll be like a completely different picture. So it just kind of takes a lot of the guesswork out of it because everyone is so different. So, what it's looking at is, and basically it's timed after ovulation, right? Because after ovulation is when progesterone levels peak. So that's when the test is looking at all of those hormone levels to see if you're basically making your peak progesterone levels. So it looks at progesterone, and it also looks at your estrogen metabolism. So we have 3 different main types of estrogen, and then also it's showing how you're detoxing, right? So detoxification is primarily happening in the liver, also the gut for estrogen. But it makes it visible if we're having like healthy hormone detox, right? Or if it's going down these inflammatory problematic pathways. Because certain pathways of estrogen can increase your risk for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, or just simple things like fibroids, right? Or cyst growth or things like that. So I think the estrogen detoxification is really important too. So we can look at that. And then we see all of the androgens, and especially in cases like PCOS, right? That's extra important. But even if the woman isn't diagnosed with PCOS, I'm still seeing a lot of imbalances a lot of the times with androgens, right? And androgens are those male type hormones. So like testosterone is an example of that, or DHEA. And especially as the woman ages, especially after age 35, DHEA levels drop off pretty drastically. And DHEA is basically like the building block to all of our sex hormones, right? So if we don't have that building block or substrate in place, then all of our other hormones are going to be affected by that. So it just, we know exactly what's going on, which is helpful. So definitely the Dutch test is a key one. I don't know if I forgot anything big talking about the Dutch test that you can think of.
No, I think that's great. And that really highlights like this is the benefit of seeing a naturopathic physician, and especially, if you're focused on fertility, the benefit of seeing someone who is very, expert in fertility. So, that all the tests you just ran through, and there's more in there, but there's all of those are not necessarily tested when you see just, your primary doctor and talk about fertility. That stuff isn't necessarily being looked at. And then the quality of the testing is important too, right? Because, that's like the foundation. If you're going to go off test results, well, how good is the actual test?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, and it's obviously it's important, right, to see what's going on, but then when you implement things to balance what you see and it's successful, that's what matters, right? And that's definitely the case with the Dutch test. It's always very applicable and accurate information. And then the other piece of it, which I didn't mention, was the adrenal panel, right? So we have 2 adrenal glands. They sit on top of our kidneys, and they make a few different things, one of them being our stress hormone cortisol. They also make DHEA, which I mentioned. So, especially for fertility, and again, with women who are aging or have chronic stress, adrenals are really critical to look at for fertility.
Yeah.
And then, there's also some kind of more basic markers that you can have checked with like your medical doctor, right? So there's still important labs in regards to fertility that you can request from any doctor, your PCP or your OB or anyone that you're seeing. And a lot of the times with fertility, most doctors won't do a workup until you've been kind of struggling to conceive for a while. So I think that's one of the downfalls, because you kind of don't have the answers before. They kind of provide the answers when, months or years in, when things are going wrong. But one of the most important things that you always want to make sure is in check are your thyroid marker levels, right? So thyroid is so important for fertility. And there is a bunch of different markers. One of them, the most common one being TSH. And TSH is usually, if your doctor is checking your thyroid, TSH is usually what they're looking at. So that's basically looking at the connection between your brain and your thyroid, right? Because your brain releases this hormone, which is TSH, to tell your thyroid to pump out hormones. So for fertility purposes, you really want your TSH to be less than like a 2 or so. Anything over a 2 can make it harder to conceive. And then it's also important to request like a comprehensive thyroid panel, because your doctor usually won't do that, right? So if anything, your doctor is typically going to be testing TSH and something called free T4. And T4 is your inactive thyroid hormone. So it kind of shows like how much thyroid you have circulating, but not active, right? It's not going to have bioactive properties to it. So the more comprehensive outlook on that is adding free T3, which is your active thyroid hormone. That is really what's going to have like all those important functions in your body. So you want to make sure that you're properly converting T4 to T3, right? Because a lot of people have difficulty doing this. And then also a next one is reverse T3. So reverse T3 is kind of like an inactive form of T3. And one of the things that can cause that conversion to happen is like a lot of stress or inflammation in the body, right? So if you check reverse T3 and you see it's really high, there's like this inflammatory or stress piece to it that you want to make sure you're addressing. And then also there's 2 antibodies that I always suggest that women get checked, anti-TPO and anti-TG, or TPO stands for thyroid peroxidase and the TG stands for thyroglobulin. So if those come back positive, or basically anything above like 0, then we know there is a little bit of an autoimmune thyroid response happening in the body. And autoimmune disease is essentially just when your body is kind of like falsely attacking itself, right? It kind of thinks that our own tissue, our own proteins is like a foreign invader, as if like a foreign bacteria would be. So our immune system starts to attack our own thyroid gland, and that's known as Hashimoto's. And this is really common with a lot of the women that I see as well. And it's something that's really often overlooked because it's just really not common to have those antibodies checked on like a normal lab workup. So I always suggest that women have those checked because Hashimoto's and hypothyroidism in general is just so common in women. And both of them are greatly linked to increased miscarriages and trouble conceiving. So it's really important that those are checked. So yeah, comprehensive thyroid panel is number 1. And then the other things I often recommend for women to have checked are vitamin D levels. So vitamin D is something that most of us are low in or deficient in, or on the lower end of that scale. And low vitamin D levels has also been linked to difficulty conceiving, right? It's so important for so many different things in the body, essentially everything. So that's important to make sure you have adequate levels of. And even if, they're saying that you're in range, you kind of want to be at even a little bit of a higher range. So depending on your doctor that you work with, or your naturopathic doctor or your functional medicine doctor, they can kind of guide you in the right direction in terms of dosing based on your level. But vitamin D, like 60 to 80, something in there is a healthy range for vitamin D on your lab results. And then also ferritin is another one that if it's low can be linked to difficulty conceiving. And ferritin is it's basically a way to look like your iron stores inside of your cells. So it's like a really sensitive marker of, the start of iron deficiency. So I always make sure that that's at a healthy level for the women that I'm working with too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and there's
great.
tons of other labs, but I think those are the most important ones.
Yeah. So a hormonal panel, a comprehensive look at hormones, like the Dutch test, and then thyroid panel, the comprehensive again, and vitamin D. And I think that just like a quick recap of the tests you mentioned. Did I get them all?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
And then, and this is also one that's actually measured on the Dutch test, but vitamin B12 is definitely an important one. And if you're requesting from your conventional doc, you can do like a vitamin B12 folate combination marker, which, of course, both of those are really important for cell growth, right? And things like that. So obviously it's important when you're trying to conceive and also during pregnancy.
Yeah. And so you mentioned nutrition being a really important foundation for health. Are there a few other any other like key things that really stand out if a woman is kind of preparing her body for pregnancy? And of course, there's always individual circumstances to take into account, but just like general things.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things I spend a lot of time on with women is helping them understand their cycle, because a lot of the times, and this is for all women, we're just not really ever educated on this, right? Health class in high school, we're not really taught about what our cycle is supposed to look like. And I went basically up until naturopathic medical school thinking I can get pregnant like every day of the month, right? So I think what's really missing for women is no one's teaching them this vital information. And it's really important for women to understand their body and understand what's healthy, what's not healthy, and what should be happening throughout the month. So the first thing I make sure everyone is doing, which I would say it's about 50-50 people who do, is track your cycle, right? And usually if you're trying to conceive, you usually are doing this at this point. But I often recommend to download an app. I really like the Flow app, FLO, but there's tons of free apps out there. And just, record your period, record symptoms that are happening throughout the cycle. So if you feel really bloated one day, if you have an acne outbreak, if you're having like clotting with your period, anything like that, you can note it on the app so that you have a really good sense of when is this happening, how often is it happening, all of those things, because there are definitely clues into what's happening with your hormones. And then, right, just kind of explaining to women what the first half of their hormonal cycle is, right? So the first half of your cycle is essentially your follicular phase, days 1 through 14 roughly, and then days 15 to 28. If you have a 28-day cycle, it's going to be your luteal phase. So just educating women on like what's happening at each of those phases. And then also on ovulation and how to check for ovulation, and what are signs of, leading up to ovulation. So again, everyone's kind of educated on this differently depending on where they are in their fertility journey. But you definitely want to make sure that you're having a long enough period, right? I see some women who are bleeding like 1 day or 2 days. And that's a sign that estrogen levels probably aren't as healthy as they can be. And estrogen is so important in really building out that uterine lining before ovulation happens. So estrogen is, and it often can be demonized. I feel like, estrogen dominance is a term that's kind of thrown around a lot, but estrogen is really important to make sure it's healthy in pregnancy. Of course, you want it being in a healthy level and detox properly, but you also don't want it to be too low. And then also, educating women about cervical mucus, what they're looking for in terms of cervical mucus prior to ovulation, because the cervical mucus will actually change so that the sperm can, approach the egg efficiently so that you can get pregnant. So looking for those changes before so that ovulation is happening. And then I love basal body temperature tracking. So anyone who is trying to conceive, I think it's really, really important. It's a good step to start with. So basically, basal body temperature tracking is when you take your temperature every single morning as soon as you wake up in the morning. And there's a couple of really cool like smart thermometers that record everything for you, but you can do this manually if you want as well. You just want to make sure that you're specifically using a BBT thermometer because it has 2 decimal places instead of 1. So it's more accurate, right? It's more specific. And so what you're looking for is for your temperature to increase by about 0.5 to 1 degree after ovulation occurs, right? And your temperature should stay elevated throughout your luteal phase. And basically your temperature is increasing because your progesterone levels rise after ovulation, and progesterone increases your body temperature. So it's, it's helpful because I can, 1, see if the woman's ovulating every month, right? Because some women skip ovulation depending on the month. And then 2, we can see how long your progesterone levels are staying elevated based on how long that temperature is staying elevated. So it just gives a ton of good information. And it also obviously is helpful with like intercourse timing, right? And it's really ideal to be trying to, have intercourse I always recommend at least 2 days before ovulation actually happens, right? Because sometimes when women are testing for ovulation and then they're trying to time intercourse, a lot of the changes are already kind of taking place, right? After ovulation occurs. So sometimes your chances of conceiving are less so where if you try before, because the sperm can survive for, typically like up to 5 days in the vagina, or, so it's helpful for it to kind of be in place already. This way, when you ovulate, everything is set to go. So that's definitely really important. So in terms of the smart thermometer that I mentioned, I use Daisy, which is spelled Daysy. But there's also one called Natural Cycles that I like as well. And so both of them are great. They kind of track all the temperature information for you. And the Daisy is kind of a one-time payment, and the Natural Cycles is on more of a monthly schedule in terms of the payment. But both of them are really helpful if you don't want to actually record your temperature and manually track and graph everything out every month.
Excellent. Great information here. This is excellent. Do you have any kind of general tips for your patients or clients once they become pregnant, for kind of just nourishing the mama's body, but also the growing baby? And of course, nutrition that you've already mentioned plays a role, but any general tips that you want to share?
Yeah. So I think a lot of the times, especially the moms who finally become pregnant, especially after trying so long, sometimes they can feel really strict on what they're consuming. So I have a lot of moms that feel all of this guilt when they have cravings. So, I think there's also a really big piece of it to kind of give in to those cravings that you have, right? I mean, of course you don't want to be eating McDonald's every single day, but I think there's a piece of it where you're not making yourself feel bad, right? When you're kind of giving into these things, but also the majority of the time eating as nutritionally dense as possible. And a lot of the times in pregnancy, your appetite can go through a lot of changes. So I like to always have the option, or I'll discuss at some point, they don't have to do it every day, but a healthy smoothie option, because smoothies are a really easy way to get all of that good stuff in. This way you don't have to worry about getting it in throughout the day. So I always recommend a fertility smoothie, and there's tons of different recipes or ways that you can put that together. And also in pregnancy, your digestion changes, right? So your progesterone levels are a lot higher than they normally would be. And progesterone actually slows your gut motility. And when your gut motility slows, right, digestion kind of slows as a whole. So that's why some mamas to be can become more constipated, right? Or just have less of an appetite because things are kind of in slow motion. So smoothies are also nice because they're a lot easier to digest, and you don't have to force yourself to eat something, right? If you're not feeling hungry. So that's definitely one of the tips that I'll recommend. And then a lot of moms will have morning sickness in their first trimester, especially. So I think with morning sickness, again, if you're working with a functional doctor or a naturopathic doctor, they can work on making sure that you have healthy estrogen detoxification, because sometimes if your estrogen levels are not healthy or you're not detoxing properly, that can increase your risk of having morning sickness, right? So that's important. And then, also not feeling guilty if you have to sign off your cooking duties or meal prepping duties to your partner, right? Or a family member or a friend, because some women just can't even smell the food. So I think it's giving yourself grace there too, right? And not being afraid to ask for help is really important. And then, I know you mentioned just the nutrition piece, obviously it's important, and water intake. So a lot of women are not getting enough water, and it's something that's so basic, it's often overlooked, right? And we don't really think about it very often, but you should ideally be getting about half your body weight in ounces of water each day. So let's say you weighed 200 pounds, you should be getting in about 100 ounces of water. So most people don't think they need as much water as they actually do. And, especially when you are growing another human and they're swimming in all of this fluid, water is so important to make sure that everything stays hydrated in that regard. And let's see what else. I put a couple of books here to show. So I'm just going to show them so people can know. This is specifically for nutrition. I think it's probably backward on the screen, but it's called Real Food for Pregnancy.
Oh, it's the right way. We can see it.
Okay, perfect. So this is an amazing book if there's any mom just kind of wondering, like, what should I eat throughout my pregnancy? Because I think there's a lot of misconceptions on like calorie intake, for example, right? Like eating for two is a really common phrase that moms hear. And in your first trimester, you actually don't have to increase your calories at all. But, you know, so it kind of talks about that and what nutrients or minerals or vitamins are in higher demand throughout your pregnancy, right? So things like iron, and it's nice also because it lists out all of like the food sources that you can get a lot of these things from. So you're not completely dependent on supplements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that kind of leads into my last question here. Prenatal vitamins. Of course, it's always better to get our nutritional needs met through food rather than a supplement. But with pregnancy, we know there are increased needs in different areas. So a prenatal. So what are your thoughts about prenatals? And is there anything that is really like a concern for you that you see? I know there's so many prenatals and so many that are maybe not the best quality. What would maybe be things for people to look out for?
Yeah, it's a really important question. So I think in general, like anyone trying to conceive or pregnant should be on a prenatal vitamin, unless you have like an amazingly perfect diet, right? But it's something easy you can do just to take to make sure you have all those extra building blocks that you might be missing out from diet, right? Especially just with the quality of food nowadays, our soil quality is not as good. So our food isn't as high in minerals and vitamins as it used to be way back when. So it's just an easy thing that everyone can do. I would say in terms of like prepping, I usually recommend everyone be on a prenatal for at least 3 months before actually trying to conceive, because it takes our eggs about it's a 3-month cycle, right, for our eggs. So it kind of assures that your egg is in a healthier place than it potentially would be without the prenatal. So that being said, there are definitely, like you said, tons of prenatals out there. And I think with supplements in general, because they're not FDA regulated, anyone can make a supplement. And it's unfortunate because it can be really overwhelming because there's so many options, right? And everyone's telling you like the supplement is the best. And really there's no regulation except put by high quality supplement companies, right? They have their own standards. So that's why it's really important to be getting a really high quality brand rather than just buying one off the shelf at, let's say, like CVS or Walgreens or Walmart or something like that. So when you're actually looking at a prenatal, there's a few different things that you want to pay extra close attention to, but definitely the most important one is vitamin B9 or folate. And if you're getting a poor quality prenatal, it will typically say folic acid on the label, on the ingredient label. So if it says folic acid, you don't want to take that, right? Because folic acid is not a good form of that, and it's not the active form of that vitamin. And one of the main issues is that a lot of women will have what's called methylation mutations. And this can be in a bunch of different genes. The most common one is MTHFR, right? The most commonly known methylation mutation. So MTHFR is really involved in kind of like the activation process of vitamin B9. And vitamin B9 or folate is really important in cell replication, right? So kind of growth and division. So this becomes really important when the baby is like actually growing its own cells and tissues and trying to form. So especially if women have a lot of methylation mutations, they actually will have increased miscarriage rates. So it's also another thing that you just want to kind of keep in mind. So a lot of the times once they get a methylated prenatal, right, so having that methylated version of folate, then they'll be able to conceive a lot easier, and miscarriage rates will be drastically decreased. So that's definitely the first one. So on the label, what you actually want to look for with folate is methyl tetrahydrofolate. And it usually says it'll have a number 5 in front of it. So it's a really long word that you probably have never seen before, but you definitely want to look for that versus folic acid.
I was just real quick, I was just reading an article about folic acid. different things. And they stated evidence that folic acid also, it acts as kind of like a blocker for the methyl tetrahydrofolate, the good form, the L5 methyl tetrahydrofolate, the mouthful. So the folic acid, it's not only that you're not getting benefit from it, but it could potentially be blocking your body from being able to use the good folate, the folate that we want, that L5 MTHF. So that's like another potential issue that seems to be maybe coming to light more recently, but it's, you know, definitely important to get that good form. And they even saw that that was an issue in people without MTHFR variations and just kind of the non-issue population.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely a good point. Yeah, so right, exactly, that's important. So it's not only is it, you know, not the best form, but it also can kind of be toxic to your body, right, in those pathways. So it can be doing a little bit more harm than good. So yeah, that's definitely an important point. And then, you know, I think along the same lines in terms of healthy methylation, another vitamin involved is vitamin B12. So vitamin B12 is also one that you can have a poor form of that in a prenatal or a multi, and you can have a higher quality form of that. So if you're getting like a low quality supplement prenatal, typically it'll have cyanocobalamin in it. So you don't want cyanocobalamin. So if you have that in your multi, make sure your prenatal, make sure you're getting a different one. But you typically, again, want to look for methylcobalamin. So that methyl term is really key, especially in regards to your B9 and your B12, right? The folate and the vitamin B12. So that's kind of the keyword that you're looking for to support those. And then I would say the last one that you can potentially tell if it's low quality is magnesium. So magnesium is really important in lots of things in the body, but specifically in terms of hormones, it's really important in estrogen detoxification. So that's one of the key roles, but you know, it's also helpful in blood sugar metabolism and all types of things. So when a poor form of it, you'll typically say magnesium oxide, and this is also applicable to just magnesium supplements in general. So magnesium oxide basically acts as a laxative, so you don't really absorb it at all. It's used as a laxative actually when you get in supplement forms a lot of the times because it's pulling water into your gut lumen, right, into your inside of your intestines, and that triggers you to have a bowel movement. So obviously that's not the goal with a prenatal, right? We want to absorb the magnesium so we have it for its functions. We don't want to induce bowel movement so it's not absorbed. So higher quality forms of magnesium, there's a bunch of them, but malate, glycinate, and then a lot of times you'll see citrate as well. So those are forms that are much better absorbed, right, versus the oxide.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I just want to mention with prenatals, I will sometimes have people say that's a lot of pills to be taking as one dose of a prenatal, but it is usually multiple capsules, or if it's, you know, maybe if it's a powder, it's a little bit different, but it's usually multiple capsules. It's not just one because there's so much goodness packed into the supplement, right?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so some women, you know, they don't want to take that many capsules, right? But, you know, like you said, there's a reason why there's more capsules because it has more nutrients and more value in it. So very commonly, I mean, it's going to be minimum 2 for a prenatal, but there's one that I like a lot that's 4 capsules, right? And sometimes I'll use the higher capsule ones, and it has a higher level of folate, methylated folate in it. So if women know that they have, like, for example, an MTHFR mutation, or if they've had recurrent miscarriages, I'll usually put them on that one just to be safe, because I want to make sure that the body definitely has adequate levels of those types of things. Mm-hmm. But there's also, you know, high quality prenatal powders. So if you're someone who can't take capsules, or, you know, a lot of the times moms in their first trimester, if they have a lot of morning sickness and like, I cannot swallow this pill, I'll often recommend the powder because they can add it to a smoothie or something like that and drink it, and they don't have to worry about like gagging on the capsules.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, this has been so amazing to get a little bit of your wisdom here to share with people. Is there anything else that you think is really important that you want to mention before we wrap up? You've covered a ton of stuff already, but I just want to give you the space in case there's anything else that you think is important to mention.
Yeah, I think we covered a lot. I think it's just important for women to know that there's other options, right? And if you kind of feel like you're at the end of the road with the conventional route, there are lots of different areas that can still be explored and supported. And, you know, that women, there's so many women going through this, right? If you're struggling with trying to conceive. So, you know, it's unfortunate, but it's so many women and there's so much support out there if you look for it. And just not being afraid to advocate for yourself, right? If you're not finding the help that you need from the doctor that you're working with, then take some time and do some research on your own and find someone that can really support you.
That's great advice. And I loved what you shared earlier, just kind of going back to when you touched on, you know, really taking care of the body and managing stress as much as we can, even though that's kind of a natural thing that comes up, but really just kind of recognizing that your body, it's not trying to fight with you or to prevent something from happening necessarily. It's just that it's trying to give you a message in some way, or something that, you know, if you see a specialist, could potentially be work to support to allow you to become pregnant. But just really that connection with the body, rather than thinking that it's like the body against someone, just that connection with the body and nourishing the body, because that's what's going to nourish the baby too, right? So just kind of, I liked what you shared on that earlier. Yeah, well, this has been awesome. Thank you. I'm going to share your website for Terrain Clinic below. And yeah, this has been great.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for being here. Cheers to you.
Cheers.